You're listening to the Outskirts film podcast. I'm Christopher Small, and as ever, I'm joined by my co-host.
Hello, I'm Aiko.
Hey, I'm Alonso.
This week, for the finale of our first season of the podcast, we are going to talk about one of, for me at least, the greatest directors of all time, Lino Brocka. His hothouse melodramas and biting social issue films I discovered around 10 years ago and haven't revisited since. Maybe just a bit of background information about Lino Brocka first. He was born in 1939 in Pilar in the Philippines. He grew up poor after his father was killed in a mysterious political attack. He actually has one of the great director biographies, which I'll try to condense here a little bit. He at one point became a Mormon missionary and went to convert people in a leper colony in Hawaii. And from Hawaii, he went to the mainland of the United States, to San Francisco, and quickly became homeless and knocked around a bit. At some point, a relative of his gave him many chickens, and he was going to become a chicken farmer, but he decided at the last minute to go back to the Philippines. And once he was back, he started to get involved in the Filipino Educational Theatrical Association. And eventually in 1970, he started making films, had a big box office hit with the film Wanted Perfect Mother. And that started a career that would span 60 films, more or less. When I was looking at these films again, I realized, in the last 10 or 15 years, Brocka really became canonized in some sense and really revived thanks to a series of restorations, of which there will be a new one at Il Cinema Ritrovato. But despite those restorations, when you look at Brocka's filmography, there's a huge number of films that have absolutely no reputation in the West. I think today we'll be talking about quite canonical titles, such as Manila in the Claws of Light, Insiang, Macho Dancer, Bona, Kane and Abel. The last thing to say is Brocka was working during the years of the Marcos dictatorship, which is a very, very important part of his work. He was a filmmaker who never shied away from that, never shied away from showing the brutality and ugliness of this system, which was also the case after Marcos was kicked out of power. Unfortunately, Lino Brocka died at a young age in a car crash in Quezon City in 1991 when he was just 52. As I said, he left behind a massive body of work for us to pick over and discover. So before we dive in properly to the conversation, did you have some experience with Lino Brocka's films before we decided to do this as our last project of the season?
In my case, I had some experience with Lino Brocka, but it's always like a filmmaker that even after doing this project, I kind of really want to properly do a deep dive. I was exposed to his work by a general interest in quote unquote global South cinema. Be aware of Lino Brocka and this form of production of as you were saying in the introduction, naturally there's a lot of social issue dramas and a lot of melodramatic impulses. The popular element in these films at some points, in particular in films like Kane and Abel, to me gets to a level of some, or even exploitation at some points, which I say that, well, anyone listening to a podcast knows that that's a good thing here. It's very much considered almost canonically as the greatest Filipino filmmaker of all time. And then you look at the films, and I kind of always was fascinated by the idea, if these films, particularly in a lot of Latin American context, if this was the filmmaker in those contexts, they wouldn't really be received in the same way. They would be considered too harsh, too rough around the edges, too lowbrow. And to me, that just the figure itself as this kind of idiosyncratic filmmaker, deeply distinctive, also in his visual style. The social elements that you were alluding to, his political militancy, and also that popular element and pop thrust in his work, all colliding, kind of makes him this kind of amalgamation that has always been fascinating to me.
A lot of particularly Western people say after they've discovered these films for the first time is that these films have this very heady mix between a kind of hothouse melodrama, very trashy, almost soap opera melodrama, combined with absolutely cutting anti-capitalist social commentary. And that is, more or less true depending on the film, I would say. The films really shift their emphasis between those two things. I mean, when I was revisiting Manila and the Claws of Light, I mean, yes, that film is very melodramatic, but there's times where it's almost like this kind of hypnotic documentary. Just as Insiang is, every bit as loud and trashy and nasty as I remember it. So for me, I mean, that was a big relief to discover that he's still the greatest. But I agree that it's interesting that, for someone who's so canonized, who has such a thick mythology around him, that nonetheless the films stay what they are. They're still very lively, and they're still, as you said, like, for considering that they're very canonized films, they are very melodramatic and cheap in certain moments, which is, I guess, also what's appealing about this period of Filipino cinema in general for me also.
It is interesting what you said about the dirtiness, the nastiness, because maybe it's a cultural thing that in terms of national cinema, Turkey even has more dirty, rowdy, and very loud films that I didn't find them very idiosyncratic in as a Western audience member would think, because I thought they were quite familiar in those. That tonality for me was something familiar. So it was for me, especially the social context that Brocka was representing, it was more like a natural thing to be so loud, so explicit about violence. This aspect for Western audiences become a thing. They detach the film itself from its context and turn into a pure effect. I think that's usually melodramas are for, but I think there's something that resists to that tendency to just keep it as a form of affect, of heightened emotion.
That's something we see again and again in Brocka, is this, like, he was a guy who was extremely politically active, both during the kind of martial law years, which was more or less the 1970s, and then during this kind of long people power revolution that he was very much part of in the kind of mid 80s, let's say. But something I always find impressive about his films, also the ones that I was rewatching and also Manila, is that, like, this explicit politics in the sense of like political action, demonstrations, marches, union organizing, stuff like that, is always in these films, but it's very rarely the main story. Usually these films are about protagonists who are kind of moving in parallel to this like political action. That the protagonists of these films rarely are actually themselves kind of political actors, but like that presence of politics in whatever form is always there, in some form or another. There are quite a few films before Manila and the Claws of Light, which I think was the kind of breakthrough in terms of his kind of critical success. But if you actually search his filmography in order, there are quite a few films which were more commercial and came directly out of this theatrical work that he was doing. I think the only one of those films that has kind of even a slight reputation is Stardoom, which is a film that I haven't seen but always caught my attention because of the name. And then it's like, it really was like for him this kind of drive to make like socially conscious films that pulled him in the direction that we know. And it's interesting, like, I was thinking about this as like, I was thinking about him as the last subject of our podcast, because when you read the official history of Lino Brocka, he sounds like the kind of filmmaker that we wouldn't like usually. But there's this kind of alchemy of the place that he was working, the subjects that he was drawn to, the specific way that Filipino cinema is, that just creates, I think, one of the most unique combinations. And so Manila and the Claws of Light, it's this very, very bleak, hyper-realist, often quite documentary portrait of a guy who, kind of country island boy who goes to the city to look for his sweetheart who has been kind of enlisted into some kind of slavery. When he arrives, he gets robbed, So he doesn't have any money, and he starts working in these construction sites. And the whole first third of the film is just this kind of amazingly detailed portrait of this incredibly bleak existence as a laborer, with very melodramatic touches, like at the same time as like a very, very precise accounting of, how much are you being paid? What is this scam that the boss pulls where he takes this percentage of the pay? And what is this? The Taiwan, like this so-called Taiwan move where you don't get paid the full amount because of this and that and the other. So it's like all of these details are crazy, crazy, crazy specific. But the film does have that like impulse to be also a melodrama in some way, like it's not a extremely sober film. And I think it's like the combination of those two things flowing together that makes it so, this film for me is, I remember it very fondly, but when I was re-watching it, I was really, really blown away by this one.
One of the themes that really felt closer or similar to like socially realistic films in Turkey was this theme of like, let's say there are films like, especially by Yilmaz Güney, that revolves around a professional milieu, which are usually from the lower classes, like let's say miners or construction workers. So it's a very specific and common theme that you could also found in, I think, different national cinemas. But what Brocka does here is that he expands his view of the city, or in general urban landscape, isn't limited to this particular space. And I think what's fascinating is that usually social dramas would just like stay in this microcosmos and tell a story, usually a more moralistic one, about workers' rights, and that would be the end of the film. Like we would only stay in the construction site, and because it gives you all the necessary details about exploitation, worker rights, solidarity, and how rich people and businessmen exploit these people. So you have everything, but we never we go beyond that, because Julio tries even sex work, and his girlfriend herself is also exploited by this world. But there are several layers involved also through this Chinese community who seems to be exploiting people coming from the countryside. So the microcosmos becomes a macrocosmos of the Manila itself. And I think that's such a difficult thing to achieve within the duration of a single film. That's for me, that just like the way it holds everything tightly together is it's a masterwork for me from that angle. It's like a economy of the narration is so strong and so well paced and well put together that it's amazing.
Something that has always kind of like, as I was mentioning, like made his films and his filmmaking kind of feel closer to me is kind of like just like the themes, for example, like Manila's in the close of light, like the urban alienation, kind of like descent into darkness. It's kind of like one of ongoing tropes of like popular Latin American cinema, like going back to like 1930s, for example. It's just like this like modernization process, and like the almost during the 20th century became like a kind of almost the staple of this kind of filmmaking. That is like someone from a rural area is forced to go to like the urban like escape to like find some sort of work or labor, and that kind of exposes them to this kind of like timeless tale of the corruptions of like the industrial society and capitalism and all sorts of things. But which is something you actually see a lot also like in 1950s like Mexican cinema, like the melodramas we all love, particularly with the more like grittier films of like Gabaldon or like Alberto Gut. And seeing that in the case of Brocka, to me, as you were alluding to, like microcosm of like the national state. It's also fascinating because I think that the fact that it's also in the 1970s kind of allows so different like register of like the grittiness and the realism that perhaps in the 1950s you have like a more like closer to, sometimes you have the neoreal style, sometimes you have like the vestiges of like the golden age. In the case of like these specific like the forms of, that Brocka is working with, to me what makes them like totally idiosyncratic, like again like in the Coast of Light, like the first like I think like almost like half an hour You barely have any real like plot going on. If you were to describe the plot of the film on like a synopsis, you really would start seeing the film like at the 45-minute mark or something. So to me, like the way like Brocka manages to do that with the added perhaps like oomph of like the grittiness of the 70s, to me is kind of like almost like unmatched. And I think Manila and Close like kind of like cements what I find most interesting, but also like afterwards seeing that fluctuate through his films also is to me very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention kind of Mexican films of the 50s, because just as you were saying that, I thought about this film that we saw in Locarno called Espaldas Mojadas, Wetbacks. And it's this like border melodrama. Guy crosses the border to make money, to work as a worker, and basically the tensions that come from that and so on. That's a film that I love, and obviously I love that period as well. But you know, when you think in that film about the way that, for example, scenes of these guys who have no money sitting around next to the train tracks, playing cards, talking about their lives, whatever. Like I can now, as you mentioned that, like compare that kind of scene, which is a very kind of archetypical 50s, also 30s scene in a way, with what it is here, which is a similar scene, you know, when you see these guys sitting around the construction site, but it's kind of imbued with this kind of quilt of documentary details that those earlier films necessarily just don't have. And in this film, you know, instead of there being studio sweat on their face, there's real sweat. You know, you can see that the guy's hair is greasy. You can see this, you can see that. And then, as Oku said, the fact that then he just moves away from that. You know, the film stops being that after 40 minutes. You know, you're watching that and you're like, wow, this is like the best. And then suddenly it goes and it's something else. It goes to this kind of beautiful place. I mean, the guy who gives him a place to sleep turns out to be quite a nice guy, himself a sex worker, gigolo, and he kind of like, he's like, well, if you need some money, you can try this. And he tries it, and it's like, okay, he's a little uncomfortable. And then again, it just kind of moves on. You know, it's like basically just a way to make money. And I don't know, that like the fact that that exists in the film, and if you look at the criteria on Blu-ray, like the cover is him and the guy. So clearly that's kind of the way the film, it's strongly remembered, but it's like a very small aspect of the film. And to have that, and to have that not be something very moralistic, it's probably the least moralistic sequence in the whole film, is very, very special. It's also worth saying that Brocka himself was openly gay, which was very unusual at that time among like Filipino directors. But
I mean, in his films, there are very terrible things that happens to characters, but I think you never lose the humanism. Through their action, you feel sympathy for them and you feel for them, and they're always portrayed in a dignified way. In his stories, he allows this very human moments to exist.
yes, I definitely agree with you. But then also, it's part, I think, of Brocka's cruelty that, having set all that up, he often kills those people in horribly perfunctory and brutal ways. I would say never in a kind of, you know, Michael Haneke way to make a point, but it's more of a kind of just like, this world is so horrible that even though you like this guy, even though we put a lot of effort to show him as a interesting, complex character, he's just going to be killed.
I don't know. I didn't feel like that he was just like killing those characters out of like affect, as I was saying. I think it is embedded within this social context, so you just understand that, at least like you feel that can happen, that could have happened there.
I think those two things can like coexist in his films, almost like contradictory moments, which is like there's naturally like this sense of like empathy in like the way that like the characters are framed, as Stoic was saying. Also like the scenes he allows of the characters just like being and existing in this world beyond like the requirements of the plot itself. But I think there's like a palpable sense of, I don't know if disgust is the word per se, how he views the world around them. I think, as Chris was saying in the introduction, there's like this nihilistic element of like, no matter how much empathy like I have for this character and their own journey, the weight of like the circumstances around them, like the weight of like the history that they're kind of like circumstantially just experiencing, to me is very palpable in that sense of like how the film always kind of like whenever you feel like the characters have some sort of victory, there's like always like this reminder of like no, there's like this like a systematic thing that's going on that kind of like to me relates a little bit to also to his militant like meta work in real life. And I guess that tension in his films to me is like also very interesting because kind of like takes like the just like the narrative structures a little bit like beyond just like the perhaps more pulpy elements that you can like expect. Perhaps the only exception to that might be like Kane and Abel, which I really like, but we can get into that later.
I would say that these films, have those exploitation elements, but I feel like he never or rarely kind of basks in the murder of someone who he's established as, particularly interesting. In Manila, I mean, the death of Atong and then the death of Ligaya, they both happen off screen. So it's just like the character finds out that this has happened, and it's just like super devastating. And this happens in a lot of these films. Either something happens off screen, or in the case of Kane and Abel, there's this horrible death which just comes from a gun being shot through a window and killing a woman and a baby, and it's like it's over. There's no music, there's no swelling synths, there's no nothing. It's just devastation.
It's all about the framing. You mentioned those like very cruel and violent moments, but I feel like we watch this universe, microcosmos, whether it's a city, whether it's a neighborhood, through the eyes of one main character. That's usually the films, like at least in the films that we watched, and that's our lens. That's how we perceive. That's through their eyes we perceive their reality, and we see their faces a lot. And their faces, I think, contain that humane quality. At least when I see this character's faces, his choices of actors and actresses are amazing. I think they contain that humane quality. Their face is very much innocent. I don't want to say naive, but they have this very generous and welcoming quality. This is more about, I think, visual aspect of how their faces, their facial expressions look. And I think that's the captivating effect and why we feel connection to these characters. Although all these atrocities and brutal murders, abductions are happening, we just want to stick to that expression.
If you look at the most like canonical or most well-known Lino Brocka films, at least like in the Western releases, like they always have like a portrait shot or like a very like close-up as of the main character as the kind of like this like central like of the poster of like the DVD or Blu-ray release. And to me that speaks also to like how he kind of engages with that throughout the films. I mean, their faces themselves are very expressive. They're not like gesticulating or like alluding to that like emotional state. Just like by being there and like letting like the camera linger on them, you kind of like get that like dramatic sense. There's like that durational aspect in those like portrait shots to me that really become, to me at least, it's what I mostly associate with like his visual grammar.
One thing that kind of crosses through my mind every time I see Manila is Rafael Rocco's face, the face of the protagonist. He has a strange kind of role in this film because at the same time he's very kind of blank. He doesn't have a backstory really. There's not a lot of kind of rich characterization going on with him, and always at first it takes me a while and I think like, oh yeah, this is going to be a big problem, like a flaw of this film, that he's basically this blank slate. But then you realize that the film is really a film basically about looking. Like he's through again and again in this film, he's looking at things, and you are looking at his face, often for very, very long sequences. I mean, the kind of central part of this film is that he's going to this Chinese restaurant where he thinks that his sweetheart is being kept as a slave, and he just sits there for hours and hours and hours, and he's just looking. And then he's looking at other people on the street. In the building site, he's looking at the other guys. You know, his face is so... And he also has this quite almost childlike soft face as well, with very soft features. So that also is like inextricably bound up in this film. The same as the building site transitioning to this kind of street melodrama. For me, the film transforms again in this final stretch with this absolutely amazing monologue by Hilda Coronel. When he finally finds her, he brings her home and they have sex, which is also amazing that this is not something that's, there's no kind of slow motion sex and since it's like cut and they're in bed naked after having sex. And she just delivers this incredible 10-15 minute monologue, basically just in close-up with a blank background. So for me, it's like also then becomes something else completely. It also becomes like this theatrical construction suddenly out of this very documentary film. And of course, Brocka was, as I said, he was very theatrically trained director and these people all in his acting troupe. So there's also that flash of that, in that moment that you suddenly see her, who of course would later be Insiang as well. And you see her as this suddenly coming completely deep, complex, rich character out of nowhere, in contrast to him, who's kind of a blank slate. It's an amazing, amazing, amazing monologue. And then it shifts and she's dead. So just the way that this film is able to incorporate all of these different moods and formal ideas and styles of performance, faces, all of this coming together in this film, it's like incredible to me.
I'm always dreaming, love will be mine. Searching, I'm always searching, till my dreaming come true. Ooh, dreaming, I'm always dreaming, love will be mine. Searching, hoping, empty and fine.
Salamat, pare. Tagal na akong di nakakaitik nito. Ba't ko napagpo dito?
Maybe we can go to Bona, because I feel like that's the first film I watched and I was very, very first into it. And after watching Insiang and Manila in the Clouds of Light, I feel like Bona kind of, my enthusiasm for Bona kind of dimmed down a bit. I think we're very limited in terms of full-fledged characters, because I think Gardo is just very difficult, and maybe that's also a particularity of Brocka, is this very I don't want to say caricatural, but difficult to understand evil, almost cartoonish characters. And I think Gardo is one of them.
In Manila, the Close Light, there's this focus on the construction side, its own ecosystem. In Bona, we have less focus on the ecosystem itself and more on the labor. Again, the domestic work that she ends up doing, the weight of this on paint work, and also very, very gender work, to me kind of has that element in there as well. To me, kind of distinguishes the film, as you were saying. Perhaps doesn't have that a dramatic power of the 70s films, but to me it's also very interesting in that sense, because to me it kind of feels as a feature length. It also has Bona herself as the character. Is interesting because it provides also a middle class perspective, which isn't really the case in the other films I've seen, at least. So that adds a social, political, socioeconomic element to kind of distinguishes the film.
I mean, I love this film. I wouldn't want to choose between the children here. I mean, it's this very perverse film also in some way, in a way that, even a film like Insiang, which I love, Bona has more of a kind of perversity, because Insiang, which I guess we'll talk about next, is this kind of like classic miserablest melodrama, with the kind of legacy of Mizoguchi and stuff like that. Whereas Bona you can feel that he's trying to make this painful and incomprehensible situation in the basic setup of Bona, which I should say. So Bona is the protagonist of the film, and she's this middle-class woman, as Alonso said. It's unusual in these films because usually they were shot in this particular slum of Manila, and Bona is this woman comes from the middle class, a very different kind of apartment that we usually don't even see apartments. We usually see kind of shanty houses and huts and things. And she's basically just bored with her family existence. She lives with her parents. She's completely uninterested in it. And she becomes obsessed, going every day to this pathetic little film shoot of some kind of action film. And she basically falls in love with this kind of bozo who's a bit player. He's handsome but stupid, and he's just like punching people on camera and stuff. And she just falls like devotionally in love with him, and then completely throws away her life in pursuit of this like ridiculous male idol. And the film is that. I mean, you just see her engaging in this absolutely self-destructive, antisocial form of existence, basically becoming a domestic servant in his house. And seemingly also she's chasing a kind of domesticity that she has literally just thrown aside from her own home, and now seemingly wants to be this little wife to this man who doesn't love her, treats her horribly, has sex with other women in front of her, is kind of borderline abusive, definitely on a mental level at least. That kind of basic perversity of the film and this kind of unknowability of her character, I think, is what makes this kind of an amazing melodrama. To me, this film is very, very special, and it really takes that right up until essentially the last 1 minute of the film. It follows that line, and then at the last minute it tips towards a kind of ugly, explosive melodrama.
As much as Gardo is a cartoonish character, the film tries to give him a certain psychological reasoning behind his behavior. Like, we hear him saying, "Oh, I was like raised by my mother like this, so that's how my mother bathed me. That's why I want to like do this and that." So his actions are somehow like given some sort of, even if it's a fucked up logic, there's a logical reason why he acts the way he acts. But for Bona, we don't have any background information about her family life or any psychological depth that would help us understand or help justify her actions. She's just defined through her obsession, and that's what I think why I find it very hard to like stand with this character.
Well, I guess to me that one-dimensional element, kind of how I approach these kind of films, is like they essentially like avatars for like one concept or one idea. They're not really like fully fledged characters in the traditional like dramatic sense. And I think particularly, I don't know if like I'm too permissive with like a quote unquote like a social like militant films or like political films, but I get that kind of like it's the only thing you really need to, at least in my experience, to know for like the film to work as more like a inquiry into the kind of relationship which is kind of establishing, which goes beyond like the specificity of like Bona and Gardo's relationship, and it's more like just again like a dissection or like a dissertation on the kind of like a patriarchal like structure it's dealing with.
I think Bona is kind of the kind of classic Lino Brocka, the kind of distillation of his style. When I was watching these films, I mean, I couldn't help but notice that a lot of them really do, a lot of the, particularly I would say, argument scenes take place in single shots. It sometimes is just the camera is there and it's just recording this very long sequence. And as I noticed that here, and I also noticed it in Insiang, which of course kind of highlights the fact that these films were made very cheaply, and they were often made in this one particular slum where Brocka had some friends and was able to shoot. and they were really shot there. I don't think there was any kind of studio work or anything like that. It was really shot there. So you can feel the kind of economical aspect of the films as well, very much coming through. So you don't see these elaborate camera movements, things like that, blowing through the space or whatever. Everything is quite scaled back out of necessity. And I think at some point you start to feel like, also, as I mentioned, he's making a lot of films between these films that we're talking about as well. He just becomes this master of kind of economical staging. You feel these borders of the places very, very strongly. So windows, doorways, balconies, things like that are very important for these films because they become almost these kind of borders within simply staged sequences, if that makes sense.
Dito, dali. Dito. Dito. Direct. Dito lang nandun nakaraan. Okay. 4 tayo. Lagyan mo, ayos yun. Lagyan mo na epekto. Dalawa. Okay. Dito ba itong balik ko? Lagyan mo na isa, ha? Dito. Yan. Okay na. Dito ba lang kayo? Dito ba naman dito? Pag dumating ang mga polis dito, atas kayo, papagano na, habulin kayo. Naintindihan niyo ba? Ha? Diyan na yung camera, yan mo rito. Diyan ka lang, pwede ka lang dyan. Bakit wala pa itong effects? Hoy, dito, lagyan na ito ng effects. Dali! Sabi na muna ron, wala dito. Wala na akong araw eh. Sige na. Ready? Ready? Dalawa dito. Sandali lang. Ano lang? Kaya dito. Yung mga baril doon, ano bang baril ang ginamit ko?
We can move back, I guess, to Insiang, which I think is, with Manila, his most famous film. I think Insiang was also the film that people outside of the Philippines discovered Lino Brocka. I mean, I guess it was probably his 10th or 15th film, but it was a film that really kind of cemented his place abroad, because famously it was smuggled to the Cannes Film Festival. It premiered in the Philippines, and it caught the attention of Pierre Resson, who was would go on to be a huge Brocka supporter and also a Filipino of cinema in general. Somehow got wind of the film, invited it to Cannes, and the producer of Insiang smuggled the film out of the Philippines in her suitcase. Because Insiang it's this very salacious melodrama. I think it's also part of the reason that the film is so well known is that, I mean, maybe if you come from a different cultural context, but I remember seeing this film for the first time as a 19-year-old middle-class British kid and just being like, what the fuck is this? And that feeling has never left me. So it's about this very painful subject matter, which is Insiang is this young woman who's living with her mother in this slum on the outskirts of Manila, and her mother takes up a boyfriend who secretly is supposedly in love with Insiang, and this explodes the tensions within an already terribly tense family dynamic, because the mother is very brutal to Insiang and beats her horribly and treats her horribly. So the arrival of this guy who's a piece of shit, petty gangster, just makes everything worse. The fact that the film was smuggled out of the Philippines to show at Cannes was because this was kind of the height of the martial law period, when Marcos had declared martial law to rule over the country without having to obey any kind of constitutional rights. The film was explicitly hated by Imelda Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos's famous wife, because she said that it showed like the bad side of our country, and like people don't want to see such filth. I think it's funny because Brocka really has these two films that are the two kind of big ones that are always nailed to the top of the totem pole. And they're very different films. And in contrast to Manila and the Claws of Light, which we've just talked about as this very kind of free-flowing, strange, evolving film, Insiang is a lot more like Bona in the sense that it's very focused. but the kind of fury of Insiang and the kind of disgust that is the heart of this film, evidenced by the very first shot of a pig having its throat slashed on camera. Like, this raw rage in this film is kind of just, I think, like nothing else that I've ever seen.
Even if it's also about disgust, I feel like in the final scene when Insiang meets her mother and she starts to cry, you also sense that what she was looking for through all these interactions, whether it's her boyfriend, whether it's her mother, I think was ultimately love that she couldn't receive from anyone. Because I think she wanted to be loved and to be taken care of. And that's what she was lacking. Like, no one in her life provided that to her in the film. And I think, to me, that was maybe the devastating aspect of that revenge, that thing she done, because she wanted to be loved.
To me, in this film, get a sense of like indignance that you were kind of alluding to moves the film in this like narrative economy in the film. Like, it's because it's a very, I wouldn't say like necessarily straightforward in like a derivative sense, but like you could like understand this film. I think mostly actually when I came to know the film was kind of described almost like as a rape revenge film. Naturally, like structurally it has those elements, but that kind of to misses a little bit of the point of like the wider like inquiry that like Brocka does into like specificity of like the social marginality and like the vividness of the ecosystem like the Insiang kind of like inhabits. Like by this point, what we've been discussing in Manila and then in Bona. To me, it's also kind of the main protagonist in the film, almost as much as the main characters. See a lot of like characters just suffering through circumstances like are outside of their own power in a lot of like Brocka films, and to me that makes a lot of sense and it's very like justifiable, particularly when the political thrust of his films goes through this like central conceit to me of like how existing in this like under like the rest of like the like socioeconomic marginality kind of implies just like this constant like raggedy state of like being subject to these horrible things, and to me that's like very specific, kind of like inform the grammar of the film itself.
Here it's just like it's a prison basically. No one. It's only alluded through the brother of this shop owner that he's studying because he wants to go to Manila. That's the only way that the outside of this neighborhood of the slums exists. That's the only thing. So in a way, Insiang, she's already living in a prison, starting with the family as the core of the society. And I think there are exceptions like in Macho Dancer, Noel, and the relationship between Noel and her sister. But I think the main source of this systematic violence that society exerts on people starts with the family, and that's why he attacks the family here and he denounces the family as the source of like violence.
There's a kind of specificity to these films in the way that they depict poverty. You know, the way that he will show you how a meal is prepared, or what it's like to go to the shop and not be able to afford things. You know, like all this like wealth of details in this film is what kind of grounds that for me. So then it's able to go to these very kind of overbaked, melodramatic, violent heights, without like, while still keeping an attachment to that world. Confinement is a huge part of Insiang, you know, of this existence. The way he depicts it, the way he depicts where she sleeps, the scene when she's raped. All of these things are like about a sense of entrapment.
The ruthlessness of the film, that revenge arc, when it gets to that, subverting those two different things, which is like the perhaps more like classically or traditional, like more like art house inclined melodramatic element of having like perhaps more like a taste, well, not necessarily tasteful, more like detached conclusion that doesn't get its hands dirty and goes more to like the symbolism and to like the suggestion, but also doesn't really fully get to like which again is not necessarily a bad thing, but there's not like this cathartic, exploitative element in the violence per se. There's like almost like a dry sense. So like, yeah, this is like justifiable. This is understood, but doesn't really erase kind of like the initial like dourness of like the scent of like sordidness that kind of permeates the film, which is one thing we're going back to. Is like, despite whatever happens to the characters we're kind of seeing through the films, there's this like permeating sense that like the like horrible like world they kind of like inhabit will kind of like continue being that way. And in that sense, what kind of like saying like this kind of feels almost dry and almost kind of like, I wouldn't say like anticlimactic, because it feels like there's like an important release, but it's also a sense that is just like part of the struggle, if it makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And also, thinking about this idea of shooting in the slums, in this sense, this slum is Tondo. It's known as Tondo on the outskirts of Manila. I was thinking about, how certainly a director today, but even a director at that time of a certain inclination would have kind of underlined the fact that it was shot in a slum. So maybe you would have these shots, like distant shots of kids playing in garbage, or this kind of stuff that would give you this feeling, wow, it's so terrible that people live like this, and so on, which is itself this kind of condescending level of distance, which isn't the case here. It's just a setting, and actually the images of life that you see generally are pretty joyful. I mean, despite the kind of horror of poverty, like I mentioned, these kids playing with a skipping rope, you never really see anything in this kind of leering fashion. It's really like almost he used it just as a kind of place to shoot, almost, like it just as a, this is what the film needed, so this is where you were going to shoot. It's like a material fact in the film. And I think again and again, he just goes to great efforts to show you that fact, I would say.
Inay? Bakit ba hindi mo ko pabayaan? Ang inay ko, hindi bale. Pero ikaw, sino ka para makialam sa buhay ko?
Dapat pa nga magpasalamat ka eh. Dahil madalas, akong tumutulong sa'yo para tigilan ng inay mo, para di kasaktan.
Bakit ba lagi may pinagtatanggol ang babaeng yan?
Bigyan mo pa ako ng pagkakataon, Insiang. Patutunayan ko sa'yo, mahal kita talaga.
But Alonso, you said that your first film was Kane and Abel. So how was that? I mean, because I had the kind of stereotypical white westerner introduction to Lino Brocka with Insiang, but you had Kane and Abel, which is quite a different introduction.
I guess it had an impact in how like I approached the rest of Brocka's career, because naturally, like it's to me, this kind of like more the pulpiest film from him that I've seen. And also has like a different like emotional frequency, but kind of has those both elements, like those two elements are very present. And I guess despite being more like structurally outwardly this kind of like confrontation and like faction warfare informed, but again, like, well, the name Kane and Abel was kind of like, well, I was raised Catholic, so there's like this clearly like a biblical tradition was kind of appealing. Seeing how much like melodramatic intensity really be at the heart of all the violence that occurs like around the characters was perhaps like a very illuminating experience. You can understand, I think, like his whole like body of work, or at least the films I've seen, through this film, but also the distinctiveness is kind of like modular in the sense that I can, now that I've seen more films, you can take elements from them and can kind of like create like a genealogy that leads towards this film.
I really like Kane and Abel. I mean, I don't want to act like I'm in a kind of a camp against it. It's just like, to me, it's a bit, it's maybe how Urku feels a little bit about Bona. It's like very, very professional work by a master, but for me, kind of almost lacking a kind of secondary level that these other films have. It's almost like maybe how other people see these other films, which is like it's almost missing this kind of tension at its heart that takes it to a new plane. But maybe like to just go on what you were saying, I think that also can be, again, just this kind of distorting effect of the fact that we just haven't seen this man's films. But like nobody has outside of the Philippines, really. I mean, you get to 10, 12, 15 of these films maximum people have any idea about. And then beyond that, it really starts to fall off and people just don't know those films. So when you look at the films that are made around the same time as Kane and Abel, it's like films that don't look so different, or films that are like much more kind of pulpy, strange, unaccountable films that maybe we can't exactly find a place for. I don't think Kane and Abel is quite that. I mean, I think it fits quite well with the overall idea of Brocka that we have. But just to say that, like this, we're just scratching the surface. We're really going by received wisdom, even when we try and go off-road a little bit.
While watching it, I just felt like, oh, I've seen this story 100 times. I mean, that's the same. You would also say the same things for other films of Brocka, because they are melodramas. They are melodramas. They're universal. They're less about characters than what social background that they represent, in a way, as you said a couple of minutes ago. But here, I think, as Christopher said, that extra tissue of social tissue is missing. That's something that grounds the tension between those two characters.
I would agree with that in terms that it doesn't really have those depths, but I think there's like a pleasure, at least to me, like there's like a pleasure also in seeing like this more like focused work, almost like workman-like form of approaching the film, like for what it is. And also just like the violence in this film also I find very interesting. It's like the physical violence of like the bloodshed, literally, of what happens in this film. If we were earlier talking about like Douglas Sirk and like a Fassbinder, I think this is a film like perhaps you would align closer to like, I don't know, like Michael Winner or John Flynn in the kind of sensibility it has, which again that brings to me like a fascination in seeing a filmmaker that could also make this film that is also like unquestionably like a Lino Brocka film, and can work. It's very recognizable also, but doesn't need to go into like the textual analysis part of things, doesn't need that specificity of like the social milieu to work into those like perhaps the visual grammar of the film and like the way like he approaches those melodramatic elements, and finds new avenues to explore. So to me, just on the pure and almost like primal element of his films, which to me like primal element goes into those genre, be it like melodrama or be it like what we have kind of described as exploitation, is very present in this film, just perhaps in a more like a centralized and like streamlined way.
It's interesting because like I think like basic social critique of this film, if you can call it that, is quite obvious. I mean, it's a rich family. They suffer from intense Freudian problems, and basically it explodes into this mass of self-annihilating violence. Knowing this kind of structure, I was still surprised by the kind of extent of the violence, as you said, and how far he pushes that and how willing he's able to, go to great depths to show that in like this classic level of hyper detail that isn't necessarily, required by the plot, but he just pushes it further and further just to show it as this huge spectacle of violence. And as you said, he's like a very, very competent genre filmmaker as well, That's what I love about guys from this period, and why it's like basically my favorite type of director to investigate, someone who's able to make a lot of films, is that, you love them for all the reasons that you love them, but then also from time to time you realize like, oh, this person actually knew how to make a movie. Like even a lesser movie is like a very, very competent piece of craft. And this movie is super beautiful as well. It's like very unusual to see Brocka shooting in this like upper class plantation setting, which again I think brings out the theatrical side of his personality more, because you can just see like there's a kind of delight in staging for spaces like this with the backdrops, the windows, this and that, like there's just like a different visual texture to this film than in the other ones. and of course everyone's amazing. It's also this very kind of packed film with bit players, and they all really, really shine in the way that like it's in a way that it's easy to take that for granted, you know. But maybe you watch another person's film and you realize, oh no, in Brocka, like he really was able to get from this guy who appears just for 1 minute an amazing, memorable performance.
I do also think like there's like this tragic aspect on how it is put together, and like particularly in the editing of those sequences towards the end, it almost feels like there's a futility that you will arrive to that climax, like despite being presented as you as like the inevitability of the conclusion. Once you get there, it still feels like very, very different of what you expect. There's like this like register in the images and like the construction that kind of always keeps you on your toes, I think.
Ang mama mo naman wala nang iniisip kundi si Ellis.
Sino na naman ang gumamit ng kwarto ko?
Pinagamit ko muna sa mga bata.
Hirap dito sa mga tao sa bahay na ito.
Kung magsalita ka, akala mo kung sino ibang tao gumamit.
Basta ayokong may gumagamit ng kwarto ko.
Walang nakakalamang.
Gusto ko yung lupa, ma. Sa akin na lang yun.
Ako na naman ba magpapasensya?
Anak lang kita.
Si Ellis ang anak niyo. Hindi ako.
Kaya gusto mo lang makuha yung lupang yun dahil inis ka sa kapatid mo.
Very self-righteous eh. Miskin anong gawin ko, he makes me feel guilty.
Macho Dancer is about a man who lives in the countryside, whose name is Paul, and from the very beginning we learn that he has an American lover who gives him money to provide for his family, and once Larry decides to leave the country and because his service is over, Paul needs to provide for his family, he decides to move to Manila. And there he gets involved with this group of young men at his age who was working as macho dancers, strippers we can say, but also sex workers, whose main thing is to have like a live shower show. That's like they dance, but also their specific act is to like have shower together on stage. And within this particular milieu, he meets with Noel, and an important chunk of the film is also revolves around Noel and his search for his sister. So I think it's also, in terms of structure, I think a bit similar to Manila in the Clouds of Light, but here I feel like it doesn't work that well. That kind of ever-changing structure, the surprising element that's, as the narrative unfolds, that you discover, doesn't work as much. I think maybe although I also like loved and enjoyed watching it, but to a lesser extent than the others, because of this pacing problem. I think the film is too long for its own good.
It's also from the end of Brocka's career. I mean, he died prematurely, as I mentioned at the start, but also at this moment, you know, the cultural context had changed. I don't know if he had lived long enough, like what would have happened, because also I think this is something that a lot of the directors we talked about, I'm thinking also about Ati Yilmaz, that, you know, when the 90s come, it's a disaster. And with Lino Brocka, he died in 91, so he never got to live that. But this kind of like idea of like a late career rerun of your greatest hits, you know, things are stretched out a little bit longer, the pacing is a little bit off. It's not something that I've had a chance to discover in the films of this period. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. If it's not there, maybe it's something that would have come the next decade in a bigger way. A film that I saw this morning for the first time that I really, really love is a film from 1984 called This Is My Country by Anko. I alluded to it as having this amazing opening scene where basically you just follow this side character who's watching a demonstration happen. And that's really, you know, this kind of quintessential Lino Brocka work, because it's, again, about unionizing in a huge amount of detail. It's set in a printing press, which is, you know, another one of those genius melodramatic touches that you set a film inside a very loaded industry like that. And it's like in the vein of the films that we've talked about, just this absolutely perfect piece of entertainment that also just happens to be incredibly depressing and incredibly politically trenchant.
Sige pa. Libog pa pare. Sige pa. Libog pa pare. Unang tingin siya kagabi. Mukhang okay to. Lagi ko magkakasuha. Libog pa pare. Sige. Libog pa pare. Masamahin pa. Sige pa. Libog pa pare. Sige. Sige pa. Libog pa pare. Libog pa pare. Libog pa pare.
The Macho Dancer.
We are doing something special for this last episode. We are coming to you live from Il Cinema Ritrovato in Bologna. You may hear the sound of chairs being stacked in the Piazza Maggiore, bells ringing, horrible music being played. Oh, that's the joy of being live, folks. I am joined by Alonso and also by a special guest, Jorge Negrete. Sadly, Urku is not here in Bologna, but we will do our best to capture her spirit. The reason we're adding this little addendum is that after our conversation about Lino Brocka, there has been a world premiere of a brand new restoration of one of Brocka's films, which we didn't talk about in the episode you've just listened to. That is Weighed But Found Wanting from 1974. Jorge, you did a pretty good Tagalog, so do you want to say the title of the film?
Yeah, sure, why not? It's Tinimbang Kang Gunit Kulang.
That's amazing, folks.
We're gonna lose all the Filipino audience we gained on the Roman porn episode.
Or maybe lost, who knows?
Lost or gained. Well, today, let's talk about the movie a little bit. To me, this was kind of very different kind of Lino Brocka film, considering that we've just seen 6, 7, 8, and I revisited a few of them. This one is much less of a chamber drama, I would say. In Brocka's films, usually there's just a few characters, usually trapped in close spaces, maybe a mother and a daughter, husband and wife, etc. This is really like kind of this almost whole town gone evil type of horror vibe in some way, which I wasn't really expecting, and it's also kind of changing my mental timeline of Brocka's evolution, because this was his first major film, I think it's safe to say. As we mentioned in the episode before this, he just made a few as yet undiscovered assignments that are often considered fairly routine, and I think this was the first one that was kind of like a characteristic Brocka film in some way.
Yeah, to me it's also kind of like surprising to see that how open and how like choral, like the dramatic structure of the film is. Yeah, particularly with you start out with like this like central, what I would say like the central character where you assume to be, but then kind of like devolves into like this kind of like, as you were saying, like the whole town kind of gets like a shot at it. And also in this film, what I was going to say, perhaps like the first thing I was struck by was like the documentary element we were kind of discussing with Manila and the close-up light. After like this like breakthrough moment, it's kind of already here in this film, particularly like the processions and the whole like beauty queen kind of element of the film, which I think kind of amplifies that sensory experience that we had with Manila and the close-up light. And having like that hook also within what a more traditional film would use as the opportunity to just ground you in the narrative. To Brocka seems to be like it was always there, this impulse to like have this like, I wouldn't say like ethnographic, but this like reflection of like real life, quote unquote, like Filipino society, which I think really builds into like the film as it progresses. So I guess like those will be like some of the first impressions I had, and also I guess like the social issues melodrama element is like fully like on full steam in this film already.
Yeah, it's out of the cage.
Yeah, exactly. Like it really feels like, as we were discussing on the pod, like it's kind of essentially like the telenovela approach of like of taking like a social issue and making it the most like salacious, not really salacious, but like exalted way of expressing it.
literally the melodrama comes out of the womb. That's how intense it is. But for me, what was really striking is I think I can see the appeal to Italian audiences, considering that this film has like a lot of Pasolinian elements, a lot of Visconti elements. Like the first Visconti or first Pasolini films. I mean, I thought a lot about Acatone, for example, Bellissima, Mama Roma, in the way that it is very it's a choral exercise. There's like this approach to the town as a character, but there are of course like there's like a main let's say like character, which is like this young guy who has a relationship with two outcasts from the town, which it is Berto, which is a leper man, and Kuala, who is I don't know, I think she has some sort of psychotic trauma because of what happens at the beginning of the film, which is a very, as Alonso was saying, like we started like really came out strong at the gate from that first shot. But for me also, what Chris said, I think it's a very different film from what I was used to seeing from Brocka. Something completely different. I don't know if I really like the shift that he had in his next films. I appreciate it a lot. I prefer Mike De Leon myself, but I think in this one I can see the appeal, and I can see why it opened up like to international audiences. Considering the fact that there's also this trend, like in third world cinema, to exploit the melodramatic elements, also do some sort of tremendism. We call it tremendismo, like in Spanish, like this very, very crude and raw elements about rural people, about town people. But yeah, those are topics which I do not have specifically with the film, but with the way what European audiences like about third world countries.
Yeah, but at the same time, in this one, I was surprised that somehow it both, as you said, manages to be this kind of salacious melodrama, very much unafraid of showing things that like push the limit of that form. So what Jorge is alluding to is that in the opening scene, there's a kind of forced abortion with visible alien-like fetus lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And this is something that the film comes back to again and again. But at the same time, there's this unusual kind of restraint with the arc of the film. It's almost like there are several moments where Brocka kind of pushes it to the edge of high, almost soap opera, and then plays it just at the end a little more subtly than you might expect. And this I think also feeds into this kind of free-flowing entire ensemble type drama that the film has. You're constantly switching between characters. You follow some character until you believe that there might be a conclusion of whatever arc that they're struggling with, and then Brocka will kind of shift away from that, move to something else, move to something else, move to something else. In the end, of course, it does become high melodrama. It does become almost like some kind of strange inversion of Fritz Lang's M or something. In which the whole town does become this sort of evil force chasing these people. But I also think like somehow to me that's the magic of this film, that it works both sides of the street, like high melodrama and something more subtle, without ever really compromising either of those two things. So maybe also like we could say that it was a very beautiful restoration also, and it's very nice to see these films like looking in such good shape, seeing them with such a big audience.
Yeah, and also I think regarding like the restoration itself, like just like the textures of the images, particularly like the chiaroscuros we're kind of alluding to in like Marina de Coast Light, which we kind of seen not really like diffuse, but like I don't think like that element was perhaps like as prevalent in his like later films. To see like these like early 70s to mid 70s kind of like his dialogue with those kind of like expressionistic forms to me is also very interesting as someone that needs to like explore a little bit more. But in this film particularly, like the sex scene, for example, it's kind of like straight out of like I don't know, like a Jacques Tourneur film or something like that. If he would like
If he did sex.
If he did sex, exactly. But then
if he lived long enough to do that.
yeah, or then you have like this just like throwaway. What would have been like throwaway sequences, but they're just shutting these like high contrast like. Also, like you have like the characters in the front, but also like the background is like also like a very like elongated depth of field. And all those elements to me kind of like show what in other context will be like, okay, so this is the actual like start of this like masterpiece run. But again, it seems we come to this like retrospectively, kind of creates this even like attention to the narrative we'll build of Brocka, and I think that is always a fertile ground for me to kind of like throw away all assumptions, because also in the main pod we were discussing about like how most of the dramatic arcs are around like the archetypes, that characters that aren't really like fully fledged humans, but they work because of their archetypes. When in this film, like it doesn't really work like that. You have like this more almost like a folk tales story arc, and yeah, there's like this a lot of like wrenches being thrown into like what we think is like the like Brocka authorism that come out of this experience.
I also talking in regards like to the character development. When I saw the title, I thought the title had like a sort of an Osu air, I was Wade, but then found out, and I think it's
I was Wade, but
I thought it was. It was sort of tender. Also, the way that this film shifts, in genres. Sometimes it has like these very strong dramatic elements, but then it's like this sort of a coming of age story. Then it becomes like this sort of funny with these funny beats at the school, and then the whole. Showing the traditions of the village, and it had a sort of it worked like a mosaic, of different scenes, which were not like really directed by the narrative. I thought it was more like these sort of brief sketches that try to deploy exactly life in the village to build up to that climax that you were both mentioning, which funnily I now that you mentioned, I thought that we were talking before recording this about like the very close relationship, and I think Alonso mentioned it also in the podcast, that there is a very strong bond between Filipino melodrama and Mexican melodrama, because Mexican telenovelas are like really, really huge over there. And we also have like this language sort of bond. And when you look at that, you see, compare this film, for example, to the films by Felipe Casals, particularly Felipe Casals, like Canoa or Fe, Esperanza y Caridad, and you see many of those very brutalistic, not brutalistic, brutal elements, but also like this very deep connection with the people that they are shooting. Like it's not condescending in any way, but I think it's very intimate, but at the same time it's raw, as we like it.
That's a pretty good place to end. Thank you.
Your film podcast, raw as we like it.
Bakit hindi ako nakikilala? Anak ako ng mayor sa kabilang bayan. Anak ka ng mayor, wala akong pakialam basta pinagbabawal ng mga bata. O ano ba? Ano pang hinihintay nyo? Sige na! Bawal ang bata dito. Ano pang hinihintay pa nyo? Papayat naman kami. Pinagbabawal dito yung mga bata. Sige.
And now we're back at the studios of Outskirts Film Podcast. So this was Lino Brocka. And other than that, what have you guys been watching lately? I personally am still stuck in Nikatsu roman porno. So I'd love to hear something fresh, something new from you.
I finally have a new film to talk about. but it's a very well-known film, and it's also a film directed by a very old man. So I feel like I have a pass to talk about a new film here in this safe space, and that is Disclosure Day by a little lone director named Steven Spielberg. Yes, it's a film by now 79-year-old Steven Spielberg. And, for me, listeners of this podcast know very well that I'm very interested in things that are out of time. Boy, is this film out of time in many ways. I've also for me gone on this long journey with Mr. Spielberg over the years, and he's a filmmaker that I can never really kind of accommodate myself to, but remain nonetheless fascinated by. So he's kind of this prime candidate for liking him in his later kind of out of touch years. And I guess for the last decade and a half, he's been really out of touch. I mean, I don't think any of his films have really done anything for me. And this one is kind of this very self-conscious attempt to do something kind of original, make a comment on the moment and all this kind of stuff. And it's very idiosyncratic, very strange film that I think there's a point in this film, and there's actually many points in this film, but one in particular where I felt as a viewer that you were just taken to a fork in the road, and either you go with it or you just laugh at the screen. And if you decide to go with it, as I did, there's good stuff waiting for you, I would say. If you can accept very badly CGI'd forest animals and aliens that are kind of bordering on very out and out cliche, if you can swallow that, this movie will, I think, do things for you. When it was over, I was kind of surprised that I was quite moved by the film, because the film it's about this woman played by Emily Blunt, who one day starts to get this ability to somehow speak in an alien language, and it leads to this kind of contact with aliens on Earth. And it's a very naive liberal film about the belief in images, clearly made in a kind of MAGA moment. And the combination of that, the fact that the text of the film is so much rubbed in your face, that it's about this almost, quasi-religious, old-fashioned, hyper-liberal belief in the truth of images. And if you just show people images of the truth, they will believe you. I found kind of moving, that's the kind of thing that used to piss me off in Spielberg's films. But now that he's this kind of old, out-of-touch guy, there's something moving about that. And especially when combined with the fact that he's just a very, very technically assured filmmaker, brilliant filmmaker on just a kind of a image-by-image level. So you just see in this film again and again, in whatever scene it is, that he's searching for images, he's searching for a new way to shoot, I don't know, a conversation between two people, or two people in a car, or whatever it is. So there's just this combination of restless creativity and this naive belief in images somehow moved my old crusty heart. What have you guys been watching?
I guess on the opposite end of a liberal naivete, I've been watching militant Central American films. One in specific I wanted to touch about is Paul Leduc's Historias Prohibidas de Pulgarcito, which Paul Leduc is I don't think there's a more jarring transition politically from Spielberg to Paul Leduc. But that's the beauty of this podcast.
Well, it's Lino Brocka to Spielberg to Paul Leduc.
Yeah, there's something in there. Shows our range. Even in Mexico, Paul Leduc is not really that well known or studied as a filmmaker, because his films were perhaps they had a structuralist elements, but were also deeply clearly like films made with like public institutions and in like more like a collective context. His Mexican films like Etnocidio and like Rita Insurgente kind of deal with like a kind of a dissertation of like the construction of the Mexican state and like what the oppression around it. The film I'm recently was rewatching is actually doing that with El Salvador, and kind of takes like a classical text of El Salvador called like the Titular Historias Prohibidas de Pulgarcito, Pulgarcito's Forbidden Histories, and talks about from the colonial period towards like the Central American wars in the 70s and how that's kind of like shaped by this constant like foreign insertion in the country. And Luke takes that text, gives like those like a voiceover over of that text, and then like juxtaposes that text that comes a little bit earlier in time with images he recorded of like the ongoing like guerrilla struggle of the Farabundo Martí Liberation Front. So it creates this very interesting like dialectic the film kind of goes on about. And in top of that adds this kind of fascinating transitions where it's just like purely structured indications of what like the shot you will see next is. So it's kind of like close-up and like presents a close-up, and it's like zoom in and then there's a zoom in of the same close-up of this like guerrillero speaking for like 20 minutes about like the ongoing like struggle. So it's a very dense film to watch perhaps if you don't have no context or no interest in the subject matter, but I think it's one of those like non-recognizable like footnotes of like the film history that because they're clearly like kind of structured like, oh yes, it's just like a militant film and there's like an assumption of what that means. I think this film hasn't really been like presented or discussed in like the just like if you want to, we shouldn't like detach the like political element, but it's just like as a formal example of what Paul Leduc was kind of working with and the like uniqueness of his like filmic career. I think this film is like a thing of its own and also was collectively created with like the Frente Acción Popular. So it's kind of a guerrillero film that has this kind of like authorist sense in a way. If in Madrid, you can actually watch this film at the Reina Sofia Museum. And this next coming Saturday, it will be screening a part of the Reencuadrando Imágenes Bananeras, which is like a program around like a militant Central American film that's rarely shown.
Curated by?
I might have curated that program. Oiku, how's the Roman porno experience been going?
Very, very good, very good. Still going on and very interesting discoveries, to be honest. Like, at some point I was afraid that I was going to get bored of like watching these films, but like thankfully there's more than 800 of them, so there's always new discoveries to be made. And but this week I really literally didn't watch anything aside Brocka and Roman porno, but the one thing I really liked and also wrote to you guys about was The Watcher in the Attic by Noboru Tanaka. If I can speak about it again. The
king, Noboru Tanaka.
Again, yeah. He did it again. The bastard did it again, literally. But this is, guys, we haven't seen anything yet. Like, this is the period of that announces a big changes in his filmography, actually, because his style becomes so baroque, so exuberant and excessive in this film, and it's only the beginning. Because this is actually an adaptation of have you heard Rampo Edogawa Rampo, which is actually the Japanesation of Edgar Allan Poe. So this is actually a Japanese writer specialized in this like edogoro genre. It's like erogoro, eroticism and grotesque. So this film is actually the mixture of one of his novels and two of his novels, I think. One of them is The Human Chair, which is about a man who basically puts himself within a chair, like within the like the tissue of the chair for the fantasy. And the other is about a man who wanders in the attic of a building and spies on people. So it's basically the quintessential cinematographic subject of the peeping, like the viewer, the one who watches, the one who's being watched. There's this aristocratic woman called Lady Minako who notices this man watching her, and throughout the film she engages in several sexual fantasies with this man who basically puts himself in the chair to feel closer to her, who's also the driver. And there's this clown figure that we don't understand how she meets him, but there's this clown Pierrot that she's also having sexual fantasies with, but also the watcher in the attic becomes kind of like her soul mate, because they understand that their fucked upness match. So they go into like poisoning her husband, or like randomly killing a Catholic priest with the poison. And this is basically the narrative structure of the film. But compared to Shiwi's Market that we discussed last episode, it's so baroque, so crazy and rich in colors, and also in characters. I was like, what is going on? Is this the same director? And I'm really excited to watch more from him, because he also directed the Sada Abe film, which also released before Oshima's version. So I'm really looking forward to discover that film. But apparently there's also another one called Angel Guts Nami, which is also in the like Angel Guts series, and which seems to be one of the most excessive ones. So basically that's what it's in my program for next week.
To the perverts and degenerates in our audience, like, we hear you that you like this stuff. So thank you for the last episode, for listening to it so much. I mean, I don't know how that reflects on us, but we've got the message. Between that and Doris Wishman, we know that you have a taste. So we'll stop trying to do serious subjects and just do stuff for you guys. Since this is the end of the season, maybe do you want to not only add anything to this episode, or what do your reflections on this season, if you have any?
I first want to thank to our listeners, who I don't know how many of you guys are out there, but at least from our social medias, I know that people are coming to me and talking about the podcast, and that moment is one of the like best moments that I have during my day, that when someone comes to me and randomly mentions about the podcast. But I also want to thank you too for like sharing these moments every two week since January, I guess. No, was it before? But because it's been such a important routine of my daily life, and to watching these films, to discussing them, I feel very thankful for like helping me to discover like films from El Santo. Thank you, Alonso, and for Doris Wishman. It was so big discoveries, and like sharing them with you, it means a lot. And especially when you're going through like emotionally difficult periods, like those things like really stay with you. And so thank you.
It's been fun kind of creating some sort of like community around the assumption that someone can be simultaneously interested in like Santo films and like Soka show, like all the Roman porno films, and also that same person kind of appreciates like Edward Yang. Like, I don't know, like to me there's something magical in like and Shimizu and like Boris Barnett, like despite being like the algorithm telling us like each one of them works differently. I don't know, like that exploratory sense of like cinephilia, not as just like a reading list, but also like something of like a sense of inquiry and discovery, kind of like I think guides what we try to do in this podcast. And I don't know, like seeing that some people kind of like interact with that and vibe with that, I think it's like reassuring and kind of, I don't know, gives us like a sense of going forward for the Sikos mostly.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize to people that we are choosing these subjects and deciding on the direction we go basically at random, just what interests us. there is zero kind of calculation of what will be popular or what will connect with people. And I think also based on the kind of analytics and feedback that we get in a limited sense is also kind of random, that we're not sure we can really make sense of it. So I think it's like we're doing this in the spirit that Alonso mentioned, which is just for the sake of kind of defending a certain kind of cinema, no matter how heterogeneous and variegated it is, like Santo to Shimizu. Like we're just happy to fence off that area and have fun inside it. And what I wanted to say also is we will be back, I think, on August 27th. There may be something in the interim at a certain film festival that happens in the summer, but we'll wait and see. And as ever, I want to invite you to write to us. If you send us your letters, I mean, based on the success of the Roman porno episode, I want to be careful by sending too broad an offer of what you can send. But please send us letters at outskirtsfilmmagazine@gmail.com, and we will 100% read it on the air, because at this point we will just read anything. And you can send those and we will read them in the first episode that we come back. You can also send suggestions and other things like that. We're open to pretty much everything. So thank you both for this. It was a wonderful first season, and I look forward to the second.